All right, I just installed the S3 arms on my 2023 XMR700. This is how the axles look at full droop. Angles are pretty steep, but they're not binding the CV joints, so that's good. This install was a real pain in the ass. I'm gonna walk you through it real quick, and then I've got a bunch of little clips from throughout the install process that I'll throw at the end of the video for people who are doing this themselves and actually want more details. Bottom line up front, I would not recommend these arms. I think there were a lot of afterthoughts in the making of them, and I don't like the bushing design. And that bushing design drove a lot of other design choices which were pretty poor and lazy. I see this with engineers all the time. You know, you say, I want to use this style of bushing, and then you let that ruin the rest of the design. So now that they're on there, I'm pretty confident in them, but they could have been designed to be a lot more easy to install. And every time you have to work on these things to change a bushing or something like that, you're gonna be cursing. This is a pain in the ass install, probably the worst set of arms I've ever installed, just as far as frustration. If they would come with instructions again, that would have been a lot better. So first thing you do is you pull off all your stock suspension, and it'll come off pretty easy, and you're like, okay, that wasn't bad. When you start to put these arms on, you'll realize the issues. So they decided to use these big, giant bushings that are way bigger than factory. That causes a few issues. The bushing would hit the frame if it wasn't for that aluminum spacer right there. That aluminum spacer right there means all this has to come forward. That's pretty annoying because from the factory, there was a nice little insert that held two studs like this sticking out of the frame. Well, because the bushings are so big, these studs are too short. And unfortunately, the rear differential is right up against those back two bolts. So you have to cut the studs off of the insert. This is the insert I'm talking about. The stud used to be on there like that. So I cut both the studs off to remove this insert. So that's a pain in the ass, right? If they had used a factory sized and factory style bushing, you wouldn't have had to do any grinding to install this lift kit. If you don't want to do the cutting, the other option is to pull the front differential, which is a lot of work. I didn't want to do that. Then you bolt the arms on, and I decided to install this little frame stiffener backwards from how they had it. I just flipped it 180 degrees. The reason I did that was because I also did that back here. Because, again, the bushings are so big, the little factory frame stiffener would hit the steering, and it was really tricky to get in there until I flipped it. So with it flipped like that, it keeps it away from the bolts and nuts on the steering better, and it gives it just enough clearance to clear the steering throughout the entire range. You see, it does get pretty close there, but it's clearing the steering. Also, you have to do longer bolts back here because of the oversized bushings, and you have to put a shim, see if you can see it, you have to put a shim behind it. You see that aluminum shim between the arm? You really can't, really hard to see. There you go, you can kind of see it there. So it goes frame, washer, then your bushing, then the control arm. At least that's how I decided to do it. Same thing on the bottom, because they're using this style bushing, you have to have a spacer in between the frame and the bushing. Otherwise the arm could slide over the frame piece. So that means everything gets shifted forward a little bit, and this piece right here is farther forward than it used to be. Not a huge deal. The only one that fits factory is this one down here. The lower control arm front bushings are factory sized, and they fit into the frame easily. You can reuse the factory bolts and nuts there, which is very nice. And that's how it should go, right? All these other bushings were a pain in the ass. Also, the bolts they give you aren't the right length. So if you look at the back of this bolt, there's a lot of extra bolt hanging out back there. I had to replace the two bolts up here with some shorter ones. The ones they gave you had such a long shoulder, you couldn't actually tighten the bolt down. The nut would bottom out on the shoulder first, so that's pretty sloppy. But yeah, once you figure all that out by yourself without any instructions, it's not too bad, and the arms are on. Now, if you look at the top, there is a shock mount relocation. The shock comes forward about 2 inches to match the arms. So that's a spacer there, and then a bracket that goes across, kind of like a stiffener. That's pretty simple. The bolts that came with that were about the right length. I reused the factory bolts down here, but that's all. That was pretty easy to figure out. Now, what clued me in to needing these shims is that it came with these big thick shims. I'm like, I gotta figure out where these go. They included those for a reason. And I'm pretty sure the only reason those shims are there to help that bushing clear the frame. If they had used an OEM size bushing, they wouldn't have had to be ghetto and include all these shims. I say again, those bushings were a bad idea. But yeah, that's my quick walkthrough. You know, other than that, watch the rest of the video if you're gonna do this yourself, you need the details. I never figured out where the hell this went. This came with the lift, delay, the control arms. Maybe S3 will comment and tell me, oh, you're an idiot, you couldn't figure out where to put that. Well, you guys created a puzzle from hell with these control arms. Absolute pain in the ass. And yeah, now I'm gonna go test them and see if I got any squeaks and stuff. I really don't like these style bushings, so I'm probably gonna have some squeaks, and they're not greasable. I do have a ton of clearance between the tire and the fender now. These are just 32s. I'm gonna put the 33s on the 18s back on there. Hopefully that'll solve the rubbing issue. You can see there, tires, these 32s are still getting really close to the frame, and that's a 5+2 inch wheel with a 1 inch wheel spacer. So moving them forward doesn't really fix the issue, which is that the frame is really wide. They're saying you can clear 34s. I don't know what offset they're running, but my 32s are awful close to the frame, and I've already done some trimming and stuff. But whatever, one big benefit of this type of raking forward is it keeps the bumper away from the back window on your truck because the tires stick out 2 inches farther forward. And do have a 1 inch lift built in. So because of that, I've got my preload set at the minimum on the front shocks, and I've got it cranked up a little bit in the rear to maintain the factory level. Just got some questions about this on the Patreon page, so I figured I'd add it to the video to help everybody else. Why is there a spacer on this bolt was the question. That's because this bolt was too long and I was too lazy to cut the back of it off. If you don't have a spacer there, the threads of the bolt will run into the differential, as you can see. The other question was, I can't remember. Yes, because these bushings are fatter and the arm is farther away from the frame, this is a slightly weaker setup. It's a single shear type suspension for the most part. There are all these little frame stiffeners, but you know, up and down, it's totally single shear. This is very flimsy. This is only really helping in this direction. And the farther you move the arm away from the frame on a single shear setup, the more force you're putting on the frame basically. So that's pretty much single shear. That's pretty much single shear. This one I'd say is not because it's supported by the bumper. But yeah, by doing this big bushing thing, you actually make everything a little weaker and you put a little more twisting force on the frame, especially once those bushings start to wear out. All right, the mystery of this little piece has been solved. Someone commented this is a steering stop, so I'm updating the video and re-uploading it to reduce confusion. But yeah, I guess this bolt's in here somewhere. I can zoom in. This bolt's in here somewhere like this, in the bottom of your steering stem, and it strikes the little striker plate right there as some kind of a steering stop. I'm not really sure how exactly that works or where it bolts in. Those bolts and nuts are a lot smaller than these holes, but that's what I was told this was, so just passing that along. Yeah, I wouldn't put a steering stop anyway because I run a lot of different tires and I want to be able to get my factory turning radius when I'm running a smaller tire like these 32s for instance. But I guess if you want to run 34s like this lift kit allegedly will help you clear, this is the way to do it. Ironically, this whole $1,000 lift kit, this is probably the most important thing to clearing big tires because the problem with this ATV is that the frame's really wide. See how much farther out the frame comes than your control arm? That's the reason tires rub on it. It actually has really good clearance from the factory except for that spot right there. So you can see even with the raked arms, 32s almost rub at full lock. That being said, I never put steering stops that come with lift kits or portals or whatever because I like to maintain my factory turning radius. That's one of the big benefits of an ATV over a side-by-side is that they turn sharp. So why would I give that up? So playing with the front suspension on this 2023 XMR700, and I did realize that on the front, there's definitely room for a lift kit. So that's the A-arm drop down 1 inch, which is about a 2 inch lift kit motion ratio. And there's no CV joint binding. If the CV joint was binding, you'd see the arm hop up and down. So you could actually probably go to a 2.5 inch lift kit on here on the stock CVs before they start to bind. Would you break them on 33s? I don't know, but there's definitely room to put a bracket lift or spacer lift, you know, down here on this machine, which is why these A-arms have a 1-inch lift built in, even though they're raking the arms forward, which obviously raking the arms forward you would think would add more axle angle, but you can see that these arms, the CVs actually come back from the factory. So by raking them forward 2 inches and down 1 inch, you're really not doing that much to the CVs. So I think the CV joints will be fine with these arms. I think you probably could have done even a 2-inch lift and 2-inch forward if you wanted to be real aggressive or run an aftermarket CV joint. Pretty interesting. Starting to install these things. I'll give you some tips and tricks along the way. All right, there's the bottom control arm off. It came off really simple. Obviously, it's really thin compared to this really beefy one, but the bushings are excellent. So you see that's a solid rubber bushing. It's nice and it's stiff, it's mud proof, etc. Whereas these bushings are well crap. Also, look at how thin that insert is. That's a pretty thin piece of metal that's gonna be biting into the frame. Factory insert on these solid bushings is a lot thicker. Can-Am does use bolts and nuts everywhere, so to get this little front plastic valance off, that thing, there's 10mm nuts on the back. That's kind of annoying compared to how Honda does it. But once you get that off, the control arm bolt's very accessible. That's also where your winch bolts are, obviously. All right, so this side's all tore down as far as the components I'm gonna remove. I went ahead and pulled the axle out to make sure everything looked good. It's fine, nice and greased, nice sealed bearing. Everything looks good. Very light knuckle. I don't usually like aluminum knuckles, but it looks like it's working fine. You can see right away when you start looking at these bushings is that the new arm bushings are substantially fatter. And the reason they can get away with that is because this machine uses a single shear setup. Now this one is the same because that's the one point that's not single shear. That bolt right here goes through this bumper bracket and then through the frame. So you don't want to bring the bumper forward, right? So they made that one the same. But all the other mounts are fatter. Same with the lower control arm. So when most people do forward A-arms, they just simply take this tab and they hang it off the back of the arm a little bit. You see that a lot on Pioneer 500s. That way the shock will line up with the upper control arm mount, or the upper shock mount, rather. S3 didn't do that. They left the tab towards the back of the A-arm, and then they opted to push the shock mount forward, which I think is probably a better way to do it. So what happens is, this is where your shock used to be, this is where your shock goes now. They have a spacer that goes here, and then a really long bolt that goes through all of it. That's how I'm assuming it goes together. Because their bushings are wider, they have to give you longer bolts. Factory bolts won't work. Keep an eye on as you're moving your shock forward 2 inches, so it's gonna be all over these coolant lines and your other vent lines and your wire harnesses. So make sure you relocate everything appropriately with some zip ties to keep stuff from getting pinched. So the fun continues. Got the ball joints pressed in after polishing out a ton of powder coat. Thank you, asshats, for powder coating the inside of the ball joint interface. And once you get them pressed in, there's a pretty big gap between the snap ring and the arm. Usually you want the snap ring a little closer to the ball joint plate than that. They're using these preformed ball joint plates that obviously aren't exactly the thickness of the OEM ones. You can see there, that's how OEM looks, right? And this is how your $1,000 S3 arms look. So there's a couple other spacers too on the ground right there. I'm not sure if the thick spacer is going to be the way to go or if the medium spacer is going to be the way to go. So it's a tip that'll save you some time. So the kit comes with 2 or 4 long bolts. 2 of them are longer than the others. The longest ones go up top for your shock mount relocation. The second to the longest ones go down here, I think. Same stuff on the upper arm. You can see that the back of the arm is flush against the frame where it should be, and there's a pretty big gap up here. So I gotta put a shim there as well. So that's why it came with all these shims. But still, again, nothing that's a showstopper, just annoying stuff like these bolts that are included, way longer than they need to be on the bottom. Just a lot of stuff like that all over the place, to be honest. Next fun thing is that because these bushings they use are way wider than factory because they're dumb, these bolts that are inserted through the frame here and held in with a rivet won't work. So you've got to drill this rivet out right here to remove these bolts and then try to put in some longer ones, I guess. But I'm not really sure I'm gonna be able to do that without removing my diff actuator. So it keeps getting better and better. So after you drill out that rivet, you got to push these bolts out and you realize they won't come out because they're hitting, let me get the phone in the right spot, excuse me. They're hitting the differential. So these bolts are too short for the A-arms because the A-arms bushings are the wrong size. And you have to put longer bolts, but to do that, you have to remove the differential. And then there's going to be absolutely no room to get in here and work to install the longer bolts. And also the way the frame's shaped here, that big old control arm would hit right here, I think. So maybe that's why there's a spacer to get some more clearance, because they use the wrong bushings. I mean, they just decided to use these bushings and decided they were just going to stick with it and use shims and different bolts everywhere. It'd have been way easier for them to just design them properly with an OEM size and style bushing. So because I did not feel like removing my front differential and all that shit to get these bolts out, I used a grinder and cut them off in the frame. In order to do that, I had to get all the brakes out of the way, so I had a brake line. So I unbolted the brake line block and flipped the calipers up through the frame and got them over here. And now I have 2 holes to mount my control arms to. Of course, I've got to figure out what bolts I want to put there. It came with some bolts. I've got some extra bolts I'm not using in other places. So hopefully I can figure something out. But what's going to be really annoying is getting to the nuts back through here, because there's no space between the diff and that bracket, which is why Can-Am went and made this contraption in the first place. Okay, the arms are on. Took about twice as long as it should have. Would have gone a lot faster if there were instructions. They do look pretty good now that they're fitted. Pretty good maximized ground clearance. A couple things to point out about the alignment. So I just measure from the lip of the rim here to the lip of the rim here. Do that on front and back and try to get them to match. That's how I do a rough alignment. You have to thread out the tie rods a lot. And there's already not a ton of thread in there. So I think some extended length HD tie rods are in my future. That makes sense though, because the tie rod used to be straight. Now it's forward. That's how triangles work. It has to get longer to maintain the alignment. So that's not super good. Keep an eye on your tie rods after you do these arms for sure.